Welcome to our penultimate online Hexham Debate of Series 19, I think we're on. Please do like and share the debates if they pop up on any of your social media networks. To receive the Zoom link, you need to be signed up to our mailing list, which you obviously are, but you need to let other people know that if they want to join us. We do record each debate and links are sent out afterwards, and you can also usually find it if you look for Hexham TV's Facebook page or YouTube channel. As usual, our speaker will talk for about 30 minutes and we'll have another 30 minutes for questions and discussion. If you want to ask a question, just put that into the chat at any time and we'll do those after Paul's spoken. If you want to ask it out loud, you can unmute yourself and speak when you're called. Otherwise, please make sure you remain muted. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Paul Rogers, who's spoken several times for us in Hexham Debates. I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I never know how to to sum up your massive CV. And Paul's going to speak to us today about the Iran war. Is it without end? Over to you, Paul.
Thanks so much indeed. And thanks, Faith, for doing the great introduction. And let's give it a go. We were talking, I think, with Caroline and one or two of your colleagues not long ago about what to talk about. And that was just about when the Iran war was really developing back, I think, end of February, maybe the beginning of March. And we thought it best to give it a go on that one and at least try and make sense on it. And I think the tentative question was, will it go on forever or something like that? And it's still going on in a way, but it's eased up a lot, which in some ways makes it even more important to get a handle on why it's happened and whether there's a risk of a major confrontation or whether we may be just beginning to see the end. And if so, for what? So I thought what I'd try and do is split it up into three sections. One would be to concentrate on, I suppose, the aims of the three main parties to the conflict. That is, well, Israel, obviously, and the United States and Iran. Then look at how that compares with what has actually happened and where we are now. What is it? It must be about 11, maybe nearly 12 weeks since the start of the war. And then look very tentatively at what might come next and whether a slightly more stable thing could be built. It's not going to be easy to do that. We'll give it a go. I'll make sure that I don't speak for more than half an hour. It may be less, because I think this is a subject which is much more important to have as a discussion and just people throwing questions. So let's give it a go with the starters. I'll start off with looking at where Israel is concerned and why, in a sense, it has fought this war, because I think the thing one has to understand is that although an awful lot of the media content concerns what Trump is saying and doing, this is very much Israel's war from the start and continues to be. The use of force when it comes to things like mass bombing and air raids may be more American than Israeli at present, but the Israelis are also continuing to fight in Lebanon, and they're also basically a country with smaller forces than the United States, even though it's a very powerful country. So Israel itself, one has to go back a bit, I think, on this. And one has to remember that Iran itself has been through a number of phases, and the relevant ones, I think, would have to be starting with 1953, when essentially Mohammed Mossadegh, who was the prime minister, was ousted in a coup, which was largely organized by the CIA and MI6, because Mossadegh wanted to basically bring Iran's considerable oil reserves more under state control. Whereas, of course, the major oil companies, it was known as the Iranian Consortium, which consisted of 7 different large oil companies, in fact, the 7 largest ones in the world, that wanted things to stay as they were. 5 of the 7 were basically American companies. Then there was BP, and there was Shell, which is Royal Dutch Shell, which was British and Dutch. And they, of course, wanted the status quo, which was very lucrative. The Americans essentially were very unhappy with the idea of Mossadegh nationalizing the whole Iranian oil reserves, and Britain was a tool. So there was a coup stage which was successful, and they bought Reza Pahlavi, the king, if you like, whatever term you want to use, of Iran, to replace him. And essentially that was set in the period where you actually had the rule by the Pahlavis right through for what was it? I think it was 26 years, right through until the revolution in 1979. And during that time, Iran was very much the ally of the West. Britain sold vast numbers of arms to it. There were all sorts of developments, including the early development of nuclear power and the possibility under Pahlavi that the Iranians would actually be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. That was tentative, and they didn't get very far at that stage. But that would have been the long-term intention. The state was run really as an autocracy. What was really said at the time was Iran was run by the thousand families, really a rich elite who were very much in control. And that was really a necessity. And the many people in Iran, which even then had about 60 million population, were very much against the regime. But you had the secret police known as Savak, who were very much in charge of things. And that persisted right through until the 1970s, when, in essentially, there was something of a religious revolt, which was very much dependent on the influence, I think, of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the Shia religious group, faction, whatever you want to call it, in Iran. He was in exile in France, mostly in Paris, and essentially because of the internal dissensions and developing revolt against the state, essentially the regime under Pahlavi was overthrown, much to the anger of the United States and, of course, Israel as well, because Israel had very close relations with the Pahlavi regime. And one has to remember that within Iran, there was a small but significant Jewish population, as there still is. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But essentially, once you had the revolution, essentially you moved over to a theocracy, and Iran immediately faced an invasion by Iraq. And Iraq, of course, saw the opportunity in a country which seemed to be coming apart to move in and get its own influence. But that failed. And essentially, you get the situation then of Iran determined to maintain its power, and in many ways, Israel determined to prevent that if it could. I won't go into any more detail now. We might need to come back to that a bit. But certainly, from Israel's perspective, what happened in Iran was very bad news. Back in 1979, they adopted a much tougher campaign, just as, of course, the Iranians began to look for support against against Israel. And that was when the developments of Hezbollah and others came about, particularly in Lebanon, but not entirely in Lebanon. So as far as Iran was concerned, under Netanyahu, after you've had the terrible war in Gaza persisting, Netanyahu basically wanted to make sure that he could control the Palestinians in Gaza, but also make absolutely sure that the Iranians would not present a problem. And there he was hugely concerned about the Iranian attempts, so he thought, to develop nuclear weapons. And for the best part of 10 years or so, he was always telling the UN and the rest that there were only a few months and sometimes even a few weeks from Iran being a nuclear power. So for Israel, you had to have, well, basically a public uprising, which would be very good, a regime termination, but more than that, you had to go over to a secular regime and one which was fully demilitarized, including any capability to develop nuclear weapons. That was Israel's war aim. Look at the United States, it's rather different in a sense. The war aim certainly was to see regime change and prevention of nuclear power. It did not go as far as the Israelis, and it was not really thought through. But one or two things one have to remember from an American position was what the way they saw things historically. For them, the Pahlavi regime had been as near perfect as you get in the region. And it meant that the United States had pretty big influence in a country which by then had well over 80 million people, a major population. And for the Americans, they saw the need for war, obviously to help Israel, to protect Israel, because of the closeness of the relationship there. But essentially, they were not as sort of extreme in their demands, almost psychologically, as the Israelis were. But at the same time, I think you have to remember a couple of other things. In 1979, the revolution was absolute shock to the United States. And of course, what you also had was a number of diplomats and their members of their family, two or three score of them, were taken hostage in Tehran. And in fact, they were held hostage right at the end of the Jimmy Carter period in office. for something like, I think famously, 444 days. And the hostage crisis had a huge effect on American diplomatic thinking, and really was one thing that really made them even more determined, if possible, to do something about Iran. And essentially, they saw Iran as a major problem, having really significant opposition to their influence in the regime, and of course also being a threat to Israel itself. And one has to remember that one talks about the so-called Jewish lobby in the United States. That's a bit of a misleading thing. Most American Jews tend to be politically liberal. There are about 7 million, the same number as there are Jews in Israel, more or less. But essentially, they would normally support the Democrats, although obviously they have a very watchful eye on the security of Israel as well. Much of the support for Israel actually comes from the Christian Zionists, essentially the evangelical Christians who believe that a Jewish population in Israel was part of God's plan for the end days. It's known as dispensation theology or dispensationalism, that the Jews have a dispensation from the Almighty to actually control Israel right through to the end days. And essentially, that's a very important part of the United States evangelical Christian thinking. Maybe 20 to 30 million people hold that view. They tend to vote Republican, and they tend to vote more generally than Americans do, which is not a country that does a huge amount of voting in federal elections. All this means that essentially the United States saw Iran as a major threat. Just to finish off, though, turn it round as far as Iran is concerned, and one has to say that from the perspective of Iran, knowing what it might face if a major war came, what was absolutely important for them was regime survival. If the regime survived in any kind of form, then essentially they will consider the war almost as good as won. And essentially, it's a very different war aim in a sense. But that gives you some background to the different conflicting things. And much would depend really on the opening 4 or 5, maybe 7 days of the conflict. So if we go back to, what was it, February the 28th, as I say, it must be about nearly 12 weeks ago now, certainly 11 weeks ago, the war started. It was very much started by the Israelis. In fact, Trump had a lot of forces in the area already, and more were pouring in. But in a sense, that particular start was preempted by the Israelis telling the Americans, we're going to start. And essentially the start was to try and, well, kill as many of the leaders as they could, almost in the first day, sort of mass assassination, particularly of Ayatollah Khamenei, who'd replaced Ayatollah Khomeini back in, I think it was 1998, 1999, when the elderly Ayatollah had died. And essentially, Khamenei himself was certainly, I think, in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, but he was at the front of the theocracy, and the aim was to try and kill him and the leading people around him, in the expectation that there would be a major uprising against the regime. That was basically expected because there had been this uprising at the start of this last year, when in fact the regime clamped down very toughly, and essentially because of that, there was an expectation it might happen again if you like, the regime, to use the Cruz phrase, was decapitated. The leaders were actually assassinated. Essentially, that was thought very likely. Trump was saying at the time that this war could only last 2 or 3 days because people would rise up. But I think there's something misleading here. There was a major public demonstration against the regime in January and February. Hundreds, at least, maybe even low thousands of people were killed by the regime to maintain control. But there was also foreign involvement in that. And there's plenty of evidence that, in fact, there were elements within the crowds that came out who were basically agents provocateurs, trying to stir things up even more. That's not certain for now, but there's enough evidence to suggest that. And probably Israel would have had a hand in that. The problem for the Israelis and the Americans was that while there was the assassination, while a large number of the key people in the entire regime were killed, there was not the uprising. And I think there's a massive misjudgment here, both by Mossad on the Israeli side, by the CIA and the rest, And there was a degree of hubris, I think, arrogance, that it would all come apart and they would get their way. And the difficulty was that that did not happen for a number of different reasons. What is certainly true, though, is that the replacement for Khamenei was appointed almost immediately. And the end result of that was that you actually had a situation in which there was no lack of leadership. One subtle thing here, though, because if we talk about the theocracy in Iran, one has to remember that it was backed up by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And that had been formed really right back, 20, 30 years previously, at the time of the Iraqi intervention in Iranian politics, right back in 1979, 1980. And throughout the 1980s, the idea of a Revolutionary Guard Corps, kind of elite force, had grown sufficiently for it to be really almost a holder of political power when Iran basically found itself beyond the end of the Iraq war and in a potentially rather stronger position. So you actually had attempts to kill as many of the senior people in the Republican Guard and in the theocracy. What was not reckoned, although some of the analysts were saying this at the time, is if you have people replacing the ones who are being killed, and if they had thought it through, then essentially what you would get almost certainly would be people who are replacing those killed who would be even more determined to maintain power and to ensure that Iran survived. And that proved to be the case. So as we move into the war itself, which was very intense at the start, and very much an air war, then there were high casualties and a huge amount of damage done. And what was also clear was that it was not sufficient to essentially cause the end of the regime. I probably need to go into a little bit of detail in this, if you don't mind. But essentially, the situation was that within Iran, let me give an example. One of the spokespeople who was around on television fairly frequently at the time was, I think he was a brigadier within the Republican Guard force. And essentially, if I remember rightly, he was fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, as well as Parsi. So in other words, multilinguist. And that was almost the norm among the leadership. You had people who were very highly educated, very determined to maintain what they saw as the legitimate case for Iran and not to be trifled with in any sense. But even more important, they seem to have thought through repeatedly what they would do if there was a mass attack. And that, again, is an example on the American side in particular, but also the Israelis as well, of an arrogance that they basically could deal with these kinds of people. Probably an element of racism in that, but certainly the Iranians were in a position to be prepared to defend themselves in ways that were unexpected. Trump was really very keen early on to say, well, we more or less destroyed the Navy. There isn't an Air Force anymore. The army is going to be decimated and we are going to win. And essentially the Navy in Iran was relatively small, but was not small was the Marine branch of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was developing, flotillas of very fast speedboats, ways of attacking aircraft carriers or anything, often by suicide attacks. They thought this through, and they had very large numbers of them. They had also been developing, partly with Russian exchange and Russian money, a much greater capability in armed drones. And the Iranians had a system whereby they could make these armed drones, usually using motorcycle motors, almost in backroom workshops in any town of any size. So they had the capability to do this in an extraordinarily dispersed way. And dispersal was partly the name of the game. So they had that capability which they could use as and when they chose. The other thing they did was to not try and attack the American forces and the Israeli forces directly, but to do it indirectly. So they would use some of their longer range missiles in Israel, basically to remind the Israelis of what they could do. Most were shot down, but some got through. But much more importantly, they looked at how the Israelis and particularly the Americans were getting their own data about Iran. And of course, what they then did was to concentrate on attacking the satellite connections, the satellite terminals in the Western Gulf states, in Abu Dhabi and the rest, the the various systems which the Americans and the Israelis are using to do their own targeting in Iran. And they did that really quite relentlessly. There was one extraordinary exchange which showed their power. The Americans at the time, this is about 2 or maybe 3 weeks into the war, were using the Prince Sultan Air Base, probably the largest air base in Saudi Arabia, about 100 kilometers, if I remember rightly, southeast of Riyadh. And essentially, that base included one of these key E-3 early warning planes. It was on the tarmac, and a number of air refueling planes. And basically the Iranians used a sort of mass attack with drones and the rest, and they actually destroyed this key plane, and I think it was 3 or 4 of the air tankers. And that was right in the middle of the war in what should have been the most heavily defended American base. And essentially this gives you an indication of what the Iranians were able to do. And essentially that is one of the reasons why the war has persisted so long. The Iranians almost from the start worked out what they could do. They also knew almost from the start that their one advantage would be some sort of control of the Strait of Hormuz, which of course was completely free and open until the war itself started. Well, what has that meant was that there's been an impact on the war, on the world of the war, which has actually had a huge impact, most notably on the global south. And the reason for that is that most of the oil in the Middle East, if you like, northwest of the Strait of Hormuz, is oil which would normally be going to the likes of China, India, and a whole range of global south countries, right across Asia, and of course including Africa as well. So that's having a much bigger effect there than it is in countries like Britain so far. But what it means is that, very blunt about it, from a perspective of the Israelis and the Americans, they are finding that this war is unwinnable. There are a couple of things to add. Watch the time. I think we're okay a little bit for time. A couple of things to add before we move on to questions. And essentially, I think, well, for a start, the Iranians have shown capabilities which were sort of completely extraordinary. One is that the regime itself has been able to control dissent, which there is in Iran at present, and many Iranians are very angry at what is being done, and they blame the regime in part. But the regime is being basically has everything under control more than people expected. And if there was any major uprising, it would be put down with vigor. And one has to say, I've been using the term regime for Iran, and of course, Iran is in part still has democratic elements, and essentially the current prime minister, for example, is relatively moderate, and he was elected. It was a somewhat controlled ballot, but still open, and his election was a surprise. But I think what one has to accept is that Iran is now sufficiently under control, more of the Republican Guard than the theocrats, and Iran is not going to come apart anytime soon, in spite of the many, many difficulties that it has. I could also apply the term regime, incidentally, to the United States, because you could say that the United States government under Trump is so different and is using so many undemocratic methods of maintaining control. You could begin to describe that as a regime, but that would take another morning of discussion, I think, to work that out. Let me just work out what's best to sort of stay at this level. Just check, I've got 1 or 2 notes here that I want to check up on. As far as we can see, I think there are a couple of other things that are worth mentioning at this stage. One is the role of China, and the other is the role of Britain. The Britain one may surprise you, but there's a lot more going on in Britain than I think we tend to realize. On the Chinese side, China has quite a long-term relationship with Iran. It is primarily economic. China does get quite a lot of its oil, and I think some of the gas as well, from Iran, and has done for many years. And it has invested quite a lot in the Iranian oil industry as a whole. China is being very careful not to sort of take any kind of formal part in the war. In fact, I think it is much happier just to see the mess that Trump is getting into and just savor that, and in a sense, not make things any worse. But the reality is that if Iran was having huge problems and the Americans and the Israelis seem to be winning the war, then I think it is that circumstance where China might intervene, not in any warlike sense, but certainly in other ways as well, maybe with sort of selective weapons transfers. They've not done that yet to an extent, but they're in a position to do this, which is another reason, I think, why, as far as the Americans are concerned, they are in really a very major mess, whatever Trump says. Just want to say a few words about Britain. Of the countries that support Israel worldwide, you would normally say the United States is the most significant. Beyond that, there are two others, Germany and Britain. Germany mainly for historical reasons, because of the Holocaust, obviously. Britain because, obviously, it was originally a British mandate during the days of Palestine, and the very close connections which Israel has built up very carefully over many years with what you might call the British political class. I mean, you look, I think half of all the members of the current cabinet, or something approaching that, have got plenty of financial help for their offices and the rest, quite legitimate, from Israeli sources. So to some extent, you do have that close connection. One also has to say that if at any stage this war had broken into something really major, and the Americans are moving over to a policy of large-scale strategic bombing, be extremely difficult for them to do that without genuine and long-term support from the United Kingdom. The reason is that there are three bases which are very important to the United States in any action in that part of the Middle East. Obviously, RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, although more important as far as the security of Israel is concerned. But then you have Fairford in Gloucestershire and Diego Garcia in basically the Indian Ocean. Fairford is the key one to watch. That has been used by the United States because of the size of its runway and the taxiways and the rest as the forward operating base for strategic bombers. And currently in the United States, you have the most important bomber in this respect is one called the Lancer, the B-1B. And that can carry, for example, something like, each plane can carry, I think it's something like 30 cruise missiles. And those are highly accurate, and they don't even have to be sort of fired off from over the target country because they have a long enough range. And if, for example, the US Air Force decided to use strategic bombing against Iran, they would have enough planes to have 4 of these fully armed with something like 80 cruise missiles, if not more, heading for Iran every day. And they've got enough basically in Fairford to do that. So it would be extremely difficult for the Israelis to actually do that otherwise, the Americans to do that otherwise, because there's probably no other country in Europe that would allow them to use that kind of force. And so they would actually have to fly these planes from the United States, which is a huge distance, lots of air refueling, or else use Diego Garcia. But Diego Garcia is more reserved for the B-2 Spirit bombers, the ones which are really stealthy, not smaller numbers. I know that's a bit of detail, but it's important to recognize that Britain is actually far more important to the United States in this conflict than we normally are led to believe. The extent its facilities are being used, is pretty low at the moment, although it's there, but it could expand very thoroughly. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time. Just see if, looking to the future, I think there is some chance that the war may actually, in a sense, peter out. And this is essentially because one senses that within the United States, there's actually now a suspicion that they cannot win. And this is reaching beyond the people who really are absolutely crucial to their support for Trump. The people close to him still believe it's winnable. Many others don't. Of course, what Trump has done through Hexham, the defense secretary, is to actually make sure that almost all the senior military who have been dubious about fighting this war have been early retired or replaced. And so the people who are actually in the Pentagon pretty close to Peter Hexham are actually mostly people who will be prepared to continue the war. But that is not, I think, the way it's moving in the United States in political circles. And I think Republican politicians are now realizing that this war is very bad for them politically. So there is some chance that we actually may be seeing the first stages of the ending of the war. That does not mean that the Israelis in any way will curb what they're doing in Gaza or Lebanon. And it doesn't mean also that we were completely out of the woods, because you always had to remember the risk of what I call AIM, AIM, which stands, if you remember, for accidents, incidents, and mavericks. And the problem here is that under conditions of high tension, things can go wrong, particularly if you have mavericks who want things to go wrong. And I think a worry of many people in the political field is that in some respects, Trump himself is such a maverick that you can never be sure what he's going to do next. But I think we're in a slightly better position than there would be. It may be fingers and toes crossed, but hopefully the war will not last much longer. But one always has to say that rather tentatively. Faith, I'm sorry I've gone on longer than I should have done, but could we perhaps move over to questions now? Would that be all right?
Thank you very much. That's been really helpful context for how the war started, and also your view on how it might end. And you did, we had a question that you then answered in your later bit, so you were basically on questions, because Jan asked how the war might end, and you just covered that for us. I just think I saw another question come up. So I think David can't be unmuted, so I'm going to read it out. He says, can you comment further about the impact of Christian nationalism in the Trump administration on the rest of us?
Yeah. Yes, it's an important thing. I think people aren't really too aware of this concept of Christian Zionism. It was quite popular in evangelical circles in Victorian times, and it actually probably goes back. The person who was most significant in developing the thinking was actually a Plymouth Brethren pastor by the name of John Nelson Darby, and he was at the major university in Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, which is essentially, it's more of a Protestant university, if you could use that phrase. It certainly isn't that, but it's not. It's very much open to sort of the theology that you will get at that college, that university, Trinity College, would be sort of pretty widely embracing. Now, essentially, back in the 1820s, in fact, for most of the 1820s, Darby actually studied there. And what he did was to develop this idea of Christian Zionism, that in fact, the need to have the Holy Land, the sacred Christian lands, if you like, under control, may necessitate working with the Jews and having the Jews, in a sense, allowed to keep Palestine, or Israel, call it what you would at that time, really safe and ready for the end days. Basically, I suppose you would say that he was very much of the end days belief. And that, of course, has been a much stronger trend in the United States Christianity than most people realize. If you look at I'll give you a good example of this. There's a series of books published in the United States, would have been between about 15 and 25 years ago, called the Left Behind series. And essentially, that is a series of novels describing how the end days come. And it's quite a remarkable set of novels, because it has this constant thread explaining how God's plan for humanity would come about into the end days. Now, the point here is that these tend to be extremely popular in the United States. As it happens, I haven't been to the US for quite a few years, but certainly at one stage, when I was there about 15 years ago, I went into one of the big bookshops, and they had almost a large shelf of books just of these 15 or 16 books. And I think they'd had tens of millions of those sold in the previous few years. And that was really an indication of what the power is. Within Christian Zionism, as I say, you have this view that Israel is absolutely crucial to God's plan, that the end days can't even come without the Jews being in control of Israel. And of course, very sensibly, people in Israel, the propagandists and the rest, see this as something which is really of great aid to them, because they are in difficulties with the likes of Iran and the Palestinians and the rest. So from their perspective, Christian Zionism is very useful. And in fact, you have some books, the readily available books, who describe this. There's one which is certainly available now from Amazon and the rest, called Stand for Israel. And that is all about this connection. And as a result of that, you have much greater voting power, because this is the key thing. If you look at the United States as a whole, I think about 330 million people, something like 100, 110 million of them would be described quite correctly as evangelical Christians. And the United States, Christianity has a much stronger hold week by week than in many countries. Certainly get far more people going to a place of worship, almost always a Christian church, every Sunday, far more than a country like Britain. And we tend to forget this. And of course, it's the evangelical Christians, and within them, the Christian Zionists, who are really very much churchgoers. So it's a much more embedded belief. But of course, that is something which the Trump administration, he himself may not be either here nor there on that, but the people who are looking at the polls will watch that very carefully. And this is why it's so important for Trump, well, for a start, to support Israel, but in the current analysis, for this war to go well. Because if it doesn't go well, then obviously we could make major problems when it comes to the midterm elections, and that could make the last 2 years of the Trump period really much more difficult. Now, that seems to be putting it rather far, and maybe one is exaggerating this a bit, but I think it's worth going into this detail because it's something which is something not widely recognized. It's a much more important part of the entire picture than I think we tend to realize. Sorry for going on a bit, rambling on a bit.
No, thank you. I certainly didn't realize the importance of that. And Margot has got a hand up, so if you'd like to unmute yourself, Margot, you can ask a question directly to Paul.
Paul, Starmer said that British bases would be used only for defensive purposes. Is that being adhered to?
We don't know, we can't know, and I doubt very much whether the British know. The point is, if you're actually, put it this way, suppose you're flying a B-1B bomber towards Iran, you have a choice of targets. Some you might call defensive, others as clearly ones which are very much vehicles of war, which may kill civilians. How will you be able to tell if any of those missiles fired by that plane are aimed just to kill military people? I don't think you can do it. So I find that very, very disturbing that make this claim. It may be possible to some extent, but frankly, it's an unreal thing to say, because obviously, even if you are trying to claim to aim purely for military targets, there is going to be this terrible term, collateral damage. So I just don't buy into that. And I think the only way you can be sure of that is not to take part in any action which can be offensive and which you cannot yourself control. And Britain certainly could not control them. So that would be a blunt answer. I don't think you can do it.
Thanks, Paul. We've got a question in the chat from Hugh Grant. Do the US see oil or nuclear as the key priority, and could the Obama nuclear agreement have worked?
Well, this was the odd thing. I mean, I'm not sure I can answer that question, Hugh, but certainly it's worth going back because, I mean, one of the priorities of the Obama administration was to get some sort of agreement with Iran. And that was really to control the purification of uranium to get it to what was called weapons-grade material. I mean, remember that in ordinary uranium ore, I think it's less than 1%, maybe 0.7% of the material in the uranium is actually what's called uranium-235. It's basically the sort of uranium that can be used to make a nuclear bomb. And so really what becomes crucial in a country like Iran, if Iran wants to actually have civil nuclear power, and it does have one German-Russian-built reactor at Bushehr, if it wants to produce its own fuel for that, then it will use the uranium ore and purify it to the necessary what's called weapons grade. And in weapons grade, you have to have something like 90% of the uranium of this sort of uranium-235. Now, as far as the Starmer was, sorry, it's a Freudian slip. As far as Obama was concerned, if they could get an agreement out of Iran, which would ensure the International Atomic Energy Agency would fully inspect Iran's capabilities for developing uranium for reactor fuel, then that would be good enough. And that was what was decided. It took 2 years or so, pretty detailed negotiations, to produce what was called the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I think there were 7 countries and 7 participants to that, apart from Iran itself: the United States and Britain and France and Germany and the EU, and I think Russia and China were also involved. And that was signed towards the end of Obama's second term. I think, don't quote me on this, it was 2015. 2018, Trump basically withdrew from it. Mm-hmm. So in other words, he stopped the agreement carrying on. The Iranians actually held to it more or less for a couple of years. Then more recently, they've been upgrading their uranium. Now, the Iranians say that they are not trying to develop nuclear weapons. And in fact, there was a fatwa against this organized by the Ayatollah. So in a sense, what they were saying was, we will develop a capability to develop nuclear weapons. That doesn't mean we're actually going to do it. But we want that capability because we do not trust the Americans and we do not trust the Israelis. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is where we are. So again, oil is not hugely significant to the United States because it has so much of its own. In fact, it's one of the reasons why it isn't that bothered about the problem of the Strait of Hormuz. If anything, it's going to be affecting the likes of China and India more. But essentially, I think that in a way the nuclear side is symbolic. Because it's certainly true that the only country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons is Israel. Israel ignores any plea for it to be open about it, and it probably has, well, we're not sure, maybe 80 to 120 nuclear warheads of a variety of kinds and different ways of delivering them. But they do not want Iran to have any at all. In fact, that is a sort of the no-no as far as Israel is concerned. Again, I'm going on a little bit length of that, but maybe it'll help.
Thank you, Paul. Hopefully that answered your question. So Caroline asks, we understand that Trump has sacked a group of high-ranking military personnel. Can we speculate why that has happened?
Yes, I think it's part of the policy of the Trump administration. I mean, it was something said earlier on about the way in which the first part of the Trump administration, in the first period, his first term in office, was frankly pretty chaotic because they were not on top of how Washington works, frankly. They then had this, what was it, Project 2025, which was run largely by the Heritage Foundation, which is a very well-funded right-wing think tank. And that developed something like a 900 or 1,000-page plan for what to do if Trump got into power, as he did just a couple of years ago. And essentially, this time around, they were much better prepared. But one of the sort of sub-plans within the whole thing was they appoint people who were essentially favorable to the Trump's world, the Trump view of the world, right throughout government, and those people would be the key people. But of course, there has to be a follow-up to that, because in some areas of government, you cannot be sure whether people really see the world you see it. And this is true even in the United States Army and Air Force and Navy and Marines. Not everybody will fight the war the way Trump will want to do it. So as far as those were concerned, something had to be done. On the civil side, you remember there are a whole number of cases in the first year of people being sacked at short notice. Some, in fact, even had legal cases brought against them because they did not toe the line. That's been happening slightly more recently on the military side, because within the United States, some very sharp military thinkers, strategic analysts and the rest, and they know full well that Israel is making a huge mess from a military point of view of what it's doing in Gaza, and they know full well that the United States could get into a huge mess if they went to war with Iran. Now, many of those people have been retired early or essentially moved to lesser jobs. And what Hexham has done in a fairly systematic way is ensure that the key people around him in virtually all the major branches of the armed forces are loyalists to Trump wherever he can. It's not total. There is a lot of dissent there, because essentially what I was just going through, which comes mainly from military magazines, there's a lot of quite openness about this. The way in which the Iranians caught the Americans and the Israelis in particular by surprise in terms of how they responded is very clear to anybody working in the field. And that does include people in the military who may not be at the forefront, but who are there. And in my personal experience, if you have any dealings with people who are at the American war colleges, of which there are several, you will have analysts there who really do detach themselves from what's going on because they think they need to do so in the interest of American security. In other words, these are people who don't necessarily accept what the common knowledge is. They need to look more than that. And this is why I think you're getting within the United States opposition to the war and how it is being fought, not at the level of leadership, but at a level rather below that. And there's evidence of quite a lot of people, in fact, leaving the American military if they're at risk of being involved in this conflict. That is also true, incidentally, of Israel as well. So I hope that gives you some idea of what's been going on. And from a perspective of an avid Trump supporter, it makes perfect sense. And there's people who within the Israeli government who utterly believe that what Netanyahu is doing is right. Then essentially what he and the army and air force are doing is absolutely right. There are always the other views, and unless we can get inside the way people are thinking, it's going to be very difficult to actually understand how we might meet a more lasting peace.
Thank you, Paul. That was actually what I was going to ask as like a follow-on question. You did say a bit about how you thought the war might end in that it might just peter out, but can you say a bit more about how you think this is going to progress or not progress?
Well, I mean, the advice which Trump has been given by independent people is, for heaven's sake, declare victory and leave, bluntly. And it looked like he might have been doing that a week or two ago, but I think there's a lot going on in the United States higher echelons at the moment about how to get out of it. People, I think, are recognizing that they have to try and disentangle themselves from this mess. And this is why I said at the end that this is where you worry, because there are so many ways in which things could go wrong in an unexpected way, almost in an unplanned way. But I think, at one stage, I think people who try and assess the odds of this, sort of maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, were saying maybe there was a 1 in 4 chance that the Americans would find a way of disengaging themselves and getting out of the war that they got into before it gets too difficult for them to do so. I think the odds maybe are heading towards evens, which in a sense, of course, is very good news. It's moving towards the recognition that they can't go on like this. But there are plenty of people who believe that they can. And above all, one has to remember that the person who is really key to all of this is not Trump, it's Netanyahu. And Netanyahu has to have the war being fought in some way, even if it's fairly low level, right through to his general election, which is likely to take place this side of the end of October. So you have the midterm elections in early November in Washington, and you have the Israeli general election probably sometime in October. And in both ways, in one sense, in America, they want the war to end. In the case of Netanyahu, he wants the war to continue, or at least to be sufficiently unstable for him to say, you need me more than I need you. And it's going to depend very much on what happens really in the next few months. And I think one wants to watch out for moves by Netanyahu, which may actually be unexpected, but of such a form which keeps the Americans heavily involved. Meanwhile, as I mentioned earlier on when we were chatting, one has to recognize that Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Forces are making as much progress as they can in damaging Hezbollah and in trying to bring Israel itself safer, which it is proving difficult to do. I think one thing which people do rather tend to forget is the one thing Israel does not want to do is to fight any kind of serious ground war. In Gaza, it's been using drones and all sorts of methods with huge civilian casualties, mainly because it does not want to lose its own people. It's been that way before in Lebanon, particularly in the 1980s, and more recently It's been that way in Gaza. If you look at one of the key interventions, what was it, I think in 2012, the Israelis lost some key soldiers in one of their elite regiments. And essentially, one tends to forget the Israelis have a way of war which, of necessity from their point of view, has involved mainly indirect firepower used from the air, from drones and the rest. And they're doing that on a major scale in Lebanon. I mean, even now, they're trying to clear the southern part of Lebanon simply by bulldozing villages which have been evacuated. All this is in Lebanon, not Israel. And the reason for that is to try and make northern Israel safer. And I think the Israeli Defense Forces will do as much of this as they can for as long as they can. And you do not have the international opinion recognizing that this is something which is, again, going to be a hiding to nothing. What I think is very difficult, and understandably very difficult, to say to Israelis who believe fundamentally that they've got to be secure, is what they've done in the last 2.5 years is, if anything, make themselves less secure. I think Israel is less secure than it was 2 or 3 years ago, at least for the reason that there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who suffered hugely, lost family, seen people maimed, and they really will not in any way come to terms with Israel in its current form. In other words, they're making it more difficult to build a lasting peace. What is remarkable is that Palestinians and some Israelis, remember, are still trying to do this. There are Israelis, there's a small Israeli peace movement that needs a lot of support. But Israel as a whole does not recognize that what it is doing is fundamentally against its own security needs. There's a phrase which is sometimes used, you can summarize Israel's dilemma is that it feels it has to be impregnable in its insecurity. So it does seem to be impregnable, but it's also fundamentally insecure. And that appears to be a contradiction, but actually, sadly, it's not.
Thank you, Paul. There's a slightly different question in the chat from Martin, asking about the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was apparently predictable. Did Trump not care or not listen or want to harm others more than the USA? Or you said it didn't impact the USA perhaps as much as others anyway.
I think they did not seem to take it seriously. I mean, I think they were so convinced that the war would not even get to that stage. That all this force that the Israelis and the Americans would use would destroy the regime. People would rise up, and that would be that. So I don't think they took that threat too seriously. Even though any analyst of the region worth the salt would say this is always something you've got to take into account. There is another reason, though, Martin, and that is that if you're looking to the period of I'm just trying to think. Certainly, say 20, 30 years ago. The Strait of Hormuz was much more important to the Americans than it is now, because, of course, America went full stretch in for fracking to develop new oil and gas reserves, which is done with great success, done a lot of environmental damage and wreckage, particularly in, I think it's North Dakota, but essentially America currently is a net exporter of oil and gas. And that was not true until really quite recently. As a result of that, Hormuz, as a potential blockage, is nothing like as significant in economic terms for the United States as it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Now, people in the United States will say, yeah, that's true, of course. But if the world economy suffers, the United States is so dependent on a thriving world economy that it will still suffer. And this is why you are getting inflation in the United States. And this is why indirectly, the Trump administration has problems. If the United States is heavily dependent in direct oil terms on the Strait of Hormuz, then we will be in a very different position now. But it is still problematic for them, but not on the level it would have been. So again, a long answer, but essentially what it means is that the Strait of Hormuz was not realized to be as significant as it was because people tended to forget the nature of the impact. It will be longer term than short term.
Thank you for that, Paul. I think Jim Robertson, do you have a question you want to ask directly?
Yes, perhaps a slightly broader question, if you don't mind, Paul.
Sure.
And I suppose the question is, what is the balance between this country arguing for safety and the arms marketing issue? So, in a sense, that level of defence arms marketing, and as I say, we see the marketing as a response to poverty, and so there's an issue there in terms of peace issues.
I think when it comes to the arms trade, in fact, Jeremy Corbyn's outfit, the Peace and Justice Project, actually put together a book on this fairly recently. Unfortunately, I mean, it was doing very well, but of course, it had a short chapter about Palestine Action. And in fact, the publishers, and I was one of the editors of it, we were told by the legal advisor to the publishers that it might be really a bit tricky to have this actually on open sale, at least proposed, sort of supported in any major way. Publisher could do it, a bookseller could do it, but if you try to sell this book sort of as a sort of major event, that could be tricky. And so, in fact, that has not been done. It's a pity because it's a very good book, and hopefully, I don't think it's very likely. If, for example, that ban on Palestine Action was lifted by the higher court, then the book could be sold again. But meanwhile, we can't. But I'm almost losing my track because I've gone off on a tangent, haven't I? But essentially, I think the arms trade is hugely significant. Andrew Feinstein, who has written the standard book on it, reckons that it is by far the most corrupt form of trading in the world. There are so many options for what you might call, aid to an exporter. All sort of agencies that you can develop, which are basically ways of feeding money in to the people who are actually sort of holding on to the purse. And the end result of that is that the arms trade, the arms market, is very, very important in any country that actually produces armaments. Now, that may be going a little bit far, you might think, but that is the experience of people who work in this field. And there's some very good scholars in this field, fortunately, in Britain, who do a lot of good work on this. But essentially, I think this business at the moment about the need for Britain to increase its arms expenditure, its military spending, personally, I think we should be decreasing it, and there are very good arguments for that, because we're just not going about it in the right way. And to actually put heavy money, I mean, it seems to me almost obscene that we chop £4 billion a year off the aid budget, and by pure coincidence, put a similar £4 billion into the arms spending. It seems nonsensical, but essentially it's a very, very powerful lobby, and they can always fall back on the idea, well, if we don't defend ourselves, you're not patriotic. If you try and say, well, that kind of defense is more likely to increase the risk of war, then this is the problem. But of course, the lovely Quaker phrase people will be familiar with, if war's the answer, then it's a stupid question. But when you look at all the failures we've had in Afghanistan, Iraq, now in Iran, probably in Gaza, in Libya and elsewhere, you really do think that, we've got to do some very serious rethinking about how we work out our securities for the best of everybody.
Thanks, Paul. We're almost out of time, but Martin Schweiger's asked a question I was thinking about myself about, will the US military bases in the Gulf states be judged as being of benefit to the host countries, in that, are they not annoyed that they're getting, retaliation?
There's a lot of tension there actually between the states themselves and of course Iran. The Iranian view is essentially that if we are being attacked and our very existence as a state being threatened, in other words, they say we're facing an existentialist threat. Well, if a country on the west of the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi, actually has American bases, they to ourselves are legitimate targets. And that has gone down, as you say, like a lead balloon, obviously, with those states. But from an Iranian perspective, you can see where they're coming from. So I think it's a real shock to the Western Gulf states, Kuwait and the rest, to actually be on the receiving end of this. Why do they have their bases there? Well, partly mainly because there's always this basic fear among the Arab states that Iran, which of course is Shia Muslim, not Sunni Muslim, is a state which is a potential risk to them.
Right.
The curious thing is that, if you travel in the region, you find that the connections across the Gulf are remarkable. I haven't been to Dubai for a while, but last time I was there, somebody said, well, just go for a walk through the area to the east of the Dubai Creek, which is where you get the smaller markets, and look around. And you go there, and you actually find there are sort of shops which are clearly linked to Iran, banks and the rest.
Right.
And I remember going to Iran once, quite a few years ago, and staying with an academic. And he actually took me out in the car and took me up to the sort of some of the hilly areas north of Tehran. And there you saw what were actually the country villas of some of the really rich people, rich Shia people in Dubai, who would come over and stay in Iran for the summer heat, to avoid the summer heat. So the connections were like that. So this extraordinary thing is there are connections. And in fact, I think it's something like 10% of the population of Saudi Arabia is actually Shia. So it's a complex situation which you can't really uncover sufficiently. But the end result of this, I think, is that you get a situation where this essentially attacks which have affected the likes of Abu Dhabi, they're angry about it at the moment, but they're feeding that away for the longer term because they're going to have to do some rethinking about their relationship with the United States. And that may be something else which isn't fully factored in to American thinking at the present time.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to ask one last question that Hugh Grant posed. It's about what should we be writing to our MPs about on this, especially given what you said about the Britain's influence.
Well, one can. I mean, I know CND is concerned about that whole role of Felford. That's one possibility. Beyond that, I think Britain must do far more. I think the most important thing, frankly, is to really to get the British government to be more standing up to Israel about what it's doing internally. And this seems to me to be by far the most important thing. I mean, what is happening now in Gaza? All the Gazans are now restricted to what is about, I think it's something like 45% of the original territory, which itself is tiny. And there's virtually no agriculture or horticulture going on because either the Israelis have declared it basically a zone in which you can't enter, or else the glass houses and the rest have already been destroyed. So I think essentially Gaza has to be a prime example, and the West Bank as well. I mean, what's happening in the West Bank is appalling at the moment. So there, I think the pressure should be on Israel itself, and that's probably the best thing that the British government could do. Sadly, the current government does not seem to be very keen on that, for reasons which we would have to explore on another occasion.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been really fascinating, and you've answered all our questions very thoroughly. So thanks again for being an excellent speaker, and we hope to see you perhaps again in another series. I'm sure, unfortunately, peace won't be reigning throughout in the next, whenever. So thank you everyone for joining today. Please do join us again for our last debate of this series, which will be on Saturday, the 20th of June, with Sarah Bryson, who's the lead organiser for Tynedale Citizens and also an assistant director at Citizens UK. And she'll be talking about the political reasons and moral reasons for why community organising is so important. And we're also planning some in-person events in Hexham for the summer. So thank you very much for your time today. Sorry, overrun slightly, and hopefully see you all again in June. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.